The verse of the day is Genesis 30:1-2, and it says, "When Rachel saw that she wasn't having any children for Jacob, she became jealous of her sister. She pleaded with Jacob, 'Give me children or I'll die.' Then Jacob became furious with Rachel. 'Am I God?' he asked. 'He's the one who has kept you from having children.'" Okay, let's do a little bit of review. Let's go down the family line so that we can remember who came from who and who we're talking about. Abraham and Sarah. From the very beginning, they had Isaac, their promised child. Isaac married Rebekah, the woman that Isaac's servant found at the well and brought back to Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had the twins, so Esau and Jacob were born from Isaac. And Esau and Jacob, we've talked about, were the two that really fought. And Jacob is the one who stole Esau's blessing and his birthright. And Jacob is who we're referring to today. Jacob married a woman named Rachel and her sister named Leah. And you might be like, wow, polygamy. What's going on in the Old Testament? I asked the same thing. I was talking to my cousin who used to be a pastor, and I just had all these questions to him about okay, what's up with the polygamy in the Old Testament? And his first reply was, God allowed it, but he didn't command it. There's a lot that takes place in the Old Testament that happens because human nature, we see the trajectory of what humans do and their actions continue to get worse and worse, which is why Jesus had to come. And so when it comes to things like, incest, polygamy, them having multiple wives, there's just a lot that happens, a lot of scandal in the Old Testament. And it is a really good thing to remember that God didn't command them to do that. He didn't say, hey, do this. Humans do a lot of things that aren't right, and they take things into their own hands, and God allows it. And I think it also speaks to God's grace, how he uses imperfect people, how he's able to give grace when it doesn't look right, when we fall short, when we make wrong decisions. And in today's story, it's referring to Rachel and Leah, who were sisters, who both married Jacob. And so there's jealousy happening between them about giving Jacob more children. And back then, childbirth, giving your husband children, was one of the highest things you could do as a wife. And it brought a lot of self-worth onto the women. This is our job. This is what we're supposed to do. And Rachel couldn't have children, but Leah could. A little context about this story: Jacob really wanted to marry Rachel. He worked 7 years for Rachel's father so that he could have Rachel's hand in marriage. Rachel's father cheats Jacob and actually gives him Leah the night he was supposed to marry Rachel. And so then he has to work for Rachel's father another 7 years in order to also have Rachel as his wife. But because Jacob wanted Rachel and not Leah, but he married Leah, Leah was technically unloved. Jacob probably looked at Leah with contempt and didn't value her as much as someone like Rachel. Chapter 29 verse 31, it says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he enabled her to have children, but Rachel could not conceive. So he allowed Leah to give him many sons." And Leah is the one who actually gives birth to one of the sons named Judah. And Jesus comes from the family line of that son, Judah. So it's also really cool how Jesus chose the woman who was unloved, and Jacob didn't choose her, didn't want her, but God saw Leah and he said, you know what, you have value. I see your value, even though someone else doesn't. And you're actually going to bear a child that's going to continue the lineage that Jesus is ultimately going to come through. And I think that just speaks to how Jesus sees you. He chooses the unlovable. He sees the unlovable, and he doesn't need perfect people to have his plan come to pass. And we see that as many people in the Bible continue to make the wrong choice, but God uses it, redeems it, restores it, and then ultimately gives us the greatest gift of all, Jesus, so that you and I can be restored and redeemed and refined and filled up with love on a daily basis. When it comes to today's verse, it's very clearly highlighting jealousy and how being envious of someone, wanting something that they have, and grieving the life you have because they have something that you want, is a sin. Not only because you're not loving your neighbor well, you're not loving yourself well, and you're not trusting God, because all of the emotions that come from envy are basically saying, Lord, I don't trust you because I don't have this thing yet, which means I know what's best for me and you don't, and you're not giving me what's best for me. It's also saying that my life isn't good enough as it is without this thing that I'm needing. So it's a heart of ungratefulness. And when we continue to tell ourselves that we're lacking, of course our life is going to feel icky and not good, because when you think you're lacking in life, that's not a great feeling. And then when someone else has a blessing worth celebrating, like Leah having children, your sister having children, anyone in your life having children when you desire children, it's going to prevent you from celebrating them. When we deal with our envy and we check our heart, you end up being able to celebrate your people better, celebrate the people in your life who are going through milestones that are worth being celebrated. And you're going to have so much more love to give because you're receiving so much more love and you're trusting God with his plan. And it just reminds you that God is the one who allows babies to be born. God is the one that has the perfect timeline for when families are to be started and for when women are to get pregnant. It just reminds you, like, yeah, it's God's timing. So just because you're not having children now doesn't mean you won't, because it's God's timing. There are so many stories in the Bible where women had to wait for decades for children. And I've heard of so many stories in life of women who were told that they couldn't have children, and then they do 7+ years later. I think it's all about just being patient and accepting God's plan and God's timing, because so often we want it our way, right? And we think that it should be our way because we desire it. And it's a good thing to desire children, but it's not a good thing to stand in envy and to stand in you being the leader of your life, because that will just create a wedge between you and God. Because then most often we start blaming God for the things we desire not coming to pass, rather than just resting in his timeline and continuing to trust, asking God to give you a heart that trusts him and contending for the things that you want in faith. I think the second verse is really key. It says, Jacob says, "Am I God? He's the one who has kept you from having children." I think it's so often they get frustrated with the people in our life because we're not getting the things we desire. But ultimately, it's God's plan and his timing. But it's also important to remember that he's not wanting bad things to happen to you. He knows way more than we do. And sometimes we desire things that aren't good for us right now. Sometimes we desire things that we're not ready for. And so God needs to continue to prepare our heart so that we can become ready. So we just need to trust him. Okay?